250 years. That's how long you'll be trapped in a flying metal hurtling through absolute nothingness. No escape, no rescue, no going back. Everyone you know will perish here, and so will their grandchildren. This is the generation ship, humanity's greatest gamble. If you want to join a community of curious minds, please hit that subscribe button. Here we explore the cosmos together. Now let's get started. The concept of a generation ship sounds like pure science fiction, but it's rooted in very real science. These are hypothetical spacecraft designed to carry humans across the vast distances between stars, journeys so long that multiple generations would live and die before reaching the destination. We're talking about voyages lasting not years or decades, but centuries. 250 years, 500 years, maybe even 1,000 years drifting through the cosmic ocean, with nothing but the ship between you and the absolute zero of space. But here's what makes this question so fascinating and so urgent. We're not just imagining anymore. Scientists, engineers, and research institutions around the world are actively studying the feasibility of generation ships right now. The Initiative for Interstellar Studies recently held the Project Hyperion Design Competition in 2025, challenging interdisciplinary teams to design habitats for a 250-year journey to a habitable planet. Real people with real expertise are asking real questions about how we could actually build these vessels and keep humans alive for the entire journey. Think about that for a moment. 250 years. That's longer than the United States has existed as a country. It's 10 generations of humans. Everyone who starts the journey will be long dead before it ends. Their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren will be the ones to finally see a new world. And every single one of those generations needs to survive in a metal tube hurtling through the most hostile environment imaginable. So what are the actual challenges? What could go wrong? And based on the latest scientific research, how long could a generation ship realistically survive before systems start failing, before society breaks down, before the mission becomes impossible? The answers might surprise you. They're more complex and more fascinating than you might think. Because surviving in deep space isn't just about having enough food and air, though those are certainly critical. It's about radiation tearing apart your DNA. It's about maintaining a closed ecological system for centuries without any resupply. It's about preserving human knowledge across generations who've never seen Earth. It's about the psychological challenge of living your entire life knowing you'll never reach the destination you're traveling toward. And here's the thing that really gets me. Every challenge we face with generation ships teaches us something profound about Earth itself. Our home planet is essentially a generation ship traveling through space. It has closed life support systems. It protects us from radiation. It recycles everything. The difference is that Earth has been doing this for 4.5 billion years, and we're only now beginning to understand how. Before we dive into the technical challenges, let me paint you a picture of what we're actually talking about. A generation ship isn't like the International Space Station or even a Mars colony. Those receive regular resupply missions from Earth. A generation ship is completely on its own. Once it leaves our solar system, there's no turning back, no calling home for help, no rescue mission possible. The people aboard are more isolated than any humans have ever been in history. Current designs for generation ships, like those proposed in the Project Hyperion competition, would need to support somewhere between 500 and 1,500 people. That's not arbitrary. Scientists have calculated that you need a minimum viable population to maintain genetic diversity and prevent inbreeding over multiple generations. Too few people, and you risk genetic bottlenecks. Too many, and your resource requirements become impossibly large. These ships would need to be enormous. We're talking about structures potentially several kilometers long, rotating to create artificial gravity. Because here's something critical. Humans didn't evolve for zero gravity. Without artificial gravity, your bones lose density, your muscles atrophy, your cardiovascular system weakens, and your immune system becomes compromised. You might survive a few years in microgravity, but multiple generations? The research says no. Children born and raised in zero gravity would face developmental issues we can't even fully predict. So the ship rotates, creating centrifugal force that mimics gravity. Imagine a massive cylinder or torus spinning through space. The outer rim becomes the floor, and people live along the inside walls. It's elegant physics, but it introduces its own engineering nightmares. The mechanical systems required to maintain that rotation for centuries without failure are mind-bogglingly complex. Now, let's talk about the single biggest threat to any generation ship: radiation. This is where things get really interesting and, honestly, pretty scary. When you're on Earth, you're protected by an incredible shield. Our planet's magnetic field deflects most of the dangerous charged particles streaming from the sun. Our atmosphere absorbs what gets through. Together, these systems protect us from radiation that would otherwise sterilize the planet. A generation ship has none of these protections. Once you leave Earth's magnetic embrace and venture into deep space, you're exposed to two main types of radiation: galactic cosmic rays and solar particle events. Galactic cosmic rays are high-energy particles, mostly protons, that come from exploded stars across the galaxy. They're traveling at nearly the speed of light, and they can penetrate deep into materials. Solar particle events are bursts of radiation from the sun, less energetic than cosmic rays but arriving in much larger numbers during solar storms. Here's what this radiation does to you. It damages your DNA directly, causing mutations that can lead to cancer. It increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. It can cause cataracts. It damages your central nervous system, potentially leading to cognitive decline. And unlike radiation on Earth, where we might worry about specific exposure events, on a generation ship, you're being bombarded constantly, every second of every day for your entire life. Recent research from the University of Strasbourg, published in February 2025, modeled the genetic evolution of multi-generational populations during interstellar travel. The findings are sobering. Scientists found that radiation-induced mutations don't just affect individuals, they accumulate in the population's gene pool across generations. These mutations can affect life expectancy, fertility, pregnancy success rates, and miscarriage rates. Natural selection works on these traits, but in a confined population, harmful mutations can spread more easily than they would on Earth. The study tested different radiation scenarios. In one scenario, the spacecraft shielding works perfectly, keeping radiation at relatively normal levels. In this case, a starting crew of about 500 people showed stable genetic frequencies over centuries, similar to what we'd expect from neutral genetic drift. But here's the frightening part. When the researchers modeled shield degradation or failure, allowing extreme radiation levels, the results were catastrophic. The genetic structure of the population degraded rapidly, with mutations accumulating faster than natural selection could eliminate them. Think about what that means. Your shield isn't just keeping you comfortable, it's literally preventing the genetic collapse of your entire species aboard that ship. And shields degrade. Materials become brittle after centuries of radiation exposure. Micrometeorite impacts create tiny punctures. Systems fail. maintaining perfect radiation shielding for 250 years straight, with no possibility of resupply or repair materials from Earth, is one of the most daunting challenges of generation ship design. So how thick does the shield need to be? The depressing answer is very thick. Water is actually one of the best radiation shields, so some designs propose surrounding the habitable areas with meters-thick water tanks that also serve as the ship's water supply. Other designs use regolith, essentially packing the ship in dirt and rock. Some more advanced concepts involve magnetic shielding, generating an artificial magnetic field around the ship to deflect charged particles. Mimicking Earth's magnetosphere, NASA has been researching active magnetic shielding through programs like CERI-W-HAT, the Cosmic Radiation Extended Warding, using the Hallbach-Torus. This 2024 study explored using superconducting magnets arranged in a specific geometry to create a protective magnetic field. The concept is brilliant, but comes with massive challenges. Superconducting magnets require extremely cold temperatures to function, which means significant power requirements. They're also heavy, and in space, every kilogram counts. The Creel-Hat study found that while magnetic shielding could potentially offer better protection to mass ratios than passive shielding, the technology needs substantial development before it's ready for a multi-century mission. And here's something that really puts this in perspective. Even with the best shielding we can currently envision, astronauts on a generation ship would still receive significantly more radiation over their lifetime than people on Earth. We're not talking about eliminating the risk. We're talking about reducing it to hopefully survivable levels and accepting that cancer rates will be higher, that lifespans might be shorter, that this is simply the price of reaching the stars. If you want to understand more about the incredible challenges of keeping humans alive during interstellar travel, I highly recommend checking out my video called "The Real Reason We Can't Survive Interstellar Travel." It goes into even more detail about the biological barriers we face when we venture beyond our solar system. The video is on the card above and pinned on the comments, but radiation is just the beginning. Let's talk about something you probably take for granted every single day: breathing. Right now, you're inhaling oxygen that was produced by plants and phytoplankton somewhere on Earth. You're exhaling carbon dioxide that those same plants will absorb and convert back into oxygen. You don't think about it because Earth's biosphere has been doing this for billions of years. It just works. Now imagine you're on a generation ship. You take a breath. Where did that oxygen come from? You exhale. Where does that carbon dioxide go? Every breath you take, every breath your children take, every breath their children take for the next 250 years has to be accounted for. This is the challenge of environmental control and life support systems, and it's way more complicated than you might think. Currently, the International Space Station uses what we call physicochemical life support. Machines split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis. Other machines scrub carbon dioxide from the air using chemical filters. It works, but it's not sustainable for centuries. Those chemical filters need to be replaced. The systems require regular maintenance and spare parts. For a mission to Mars or a stay on the ISS, physicochemical systems are perfect. For a 500-year journey to another star system, they're completely impractical. This is why scientists are developing bioregenerative life support systems, often abbreviated as BLSS. The idea is beautiful in its simplicity. Create a closed ecological loop where living organisms recycle everything, just like Earth's biosphere does. Plants absorb the carbon dioxide you breathe out and produce the oxygen you need. Your waste becomes nutrients for those plants. Water is continuously recycled through the system. Nothing is thrown away because there's nowhere to throw it away to. Everything must be reused forever. NASA has been researching these systems for decades through programs like the Controlled Ecological Life Support System, or CELS, which started back in the 1980s. More recently, the European Space Agency has been developing the MELISA project, which stands for Microecological Life Support System Alternative. MELIS is designed as a completely closed loop using microorganisms and plants to recycle waste into food, water, and oxygen. Here's how it works in theory. You eat food and produce waste, both solid waste and carbon dioxide. Microorganisms break down your solid waste in what's essentially a sophisticated composting system. These microorganisms convert the waste into nutrients and carbon dioxide. Plants absorb the carbon dioxide and nutrients, growing and producing oxygen as a byproduct. You harvest and eat the plants, and the cycle continues. It's a simplified version of Earth's carbon and nitrogen cycles, compressed into a spacecraft. Sounds straightforward, right? But the devil is in the details, and those details are absolutely fascinating. A study published in Frontiers in Astronomy and Space Sciences in August 2023 created a stoichiometric model of a fully closed bioregenerative life support system. Stoichiometric means they calculated the exact amounts of every element, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, phosphorus, that would need to be cycled through the system to keep humans alive indefinitely without any material loss. The researchers found something remarkable and challenging. To create a truly closed system that provides all metabolic needs for a crew without any resupply, you need an incredibly delicate balance. Every element that enters the human body through food and water must eventually be returned to the system in a form that plants and microorganisms can use. If even a tiny fraction of any essential element gets locked up in an unusable form over decades and centuries, you'd experience a slow depletion that could eventually crash the entire system. Imagine this scenario. A small amount of nitrogen gets trapped in the ship's structure, maybe absorbed into materials or lost through microscopic leaks. It's only 0.001% of your total nitrogen per year. That seems insignificant, but compound that loss over 250 years and you've lost a substantial portion of your nitrogen supply. Without nitrogen, you can't grow proteins. Without proteins, you can't survive. The system collapses. This is what scientists call closure rate, and it's one of the most critical parameters for generation ship survival. Current BLSS research suggests we can achieve maybe 90 to 95% closure for most resources. That means 5 to 10% still needs to be resupplied or stored. For the International Space Station or a Mars base with regular resupply missions, that's acceptable. For a generation ship, it's a mission killer to achieve the 99.9+% closure you'd need for a multi-century voyage. Every single component of the system has to work perfectly, indefinitely. Your plants have to grow at consistent rates. Your microorganisms have to break down waste efficiently without any population crashes. Your water recycling has to capture every drop, including the moisture in your breath and the water content in your solid waste. Even human bodies themselves become part of the equation. When someone dies on the ship, their body contains valuable elements that the system needs back. Let's talk about food production specifically, because this is where things get really interesting. NASA has been conducting extensive research on algae as a potential food source for long-duration space missions. The Artemis 1 mission in 2022 carried an experiment called Fuel to Mars, which sent samples of Chlamydomonas reinhardti, a species of green algae, on a trip around the Moon. The results, published in 2025, were actually encouraging. The algae didn't just survive the deep space radiation environment, they showed what researchers called a population survival response. The space environment, including exposure to galactic cosmic radiation, potentially stimulated rather than impeded the algae's survival. Some samples even had tardigrade genes inserted into them. Tardigrades, those microscopic animals that look like tiny bears under a microscope, have a gene called D-sup that helps them survive extreme conditions. The algae with this gene showed enhanced resilience in space. Why is algae so exciting for generation ships? Because it's incredibly efficient. Algae can be used as a source of food. It produces oxygen through photosynthesis. It can potentially be processed to generate hydrogen for fuel. Some species can even be engineered to produce medicines and other biologics. It grows quickly, doesn't require soil, and can thrive in water-based systems that double as radiation shielding. Algae might be the MVP, the most versatile payload for future deep space missions, but humans can't survive on algae alone. Current research suggests a generation ship would need a diverse agricultural system, including various types of plants. The challenge is that different plants have different growing requirements, different nutrient needs, and different growing cycles. You need a mix of crops that provides complete nutrition, all the proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals humans need to thrive across multiple generations. Project Hyperion design teams had to grapple with this exact problem. How do you create agricultural systems that can reliably feed 500 to 1,500 people for 250 years with zero resupply? The designs had to include not just the growing areas but also the systems for pollination, since there wouldn't be bees in space. They had to account for crop failures and have redundancy built in. They had to consider how to preserve seed diversity across centuries, because genetic diversity in crops is just as important as genetic diversity in humans. And here's something that really illustrates the interconnected complexity. Your agricultural system affects your atmosphere composition, which affects your human health, which affects your waste production, which affects your microbial breakdown systems, which affects your nutrient availability, which circles back to affecting your agricultural system. It's a web of dependencies where a problem anywhere can cascade through the entire system. Water recycling deserves special attention because water is so critical to everything. You need it to drink, obviously. You need it for agriculture. You need it for hygiene. You need it as radiation shielding in some designs. The average human needs about 3 liters of drinking water per day, plus water for sanitation and food preparation. Plants need significantly more. A fully closed water recycling system has to reclaim water from every possible source. That means recycling urine, which is actually pretty straightforward. The ISS already does this. But it also means reclaiming water from feces, from shower and laundry water, from the moisture in the air, even from the water content in solid waste and in human bodies when people die. Every single water molecule that enters the ship at the beginning of the journey needs to be accounted for 250 years later. You can't afford losses beyond microscopic amounts. The ISS currently achieves about 93% water recovery. That's impressive for a system with regular resupply. But it means 7% is lost and needs to be replaced. For a generation ship, you'd need to push that to 99.9% or higher. The technology to achieve that level of closure exists in theory, but maintaining it without failure for centuries is unproven. Synthetic biology is emerging as a potential game changer for life support systems. A July 2025 paper published in the journal NPJ microgravity explored how genetically engineered organisms could solve multiple challenges simultaneously. Imagine bacteria engineered to break down specific waste products more efficiently than natural microorganisms, or plants genetically modified to grow faster, require less water, and produce higher nutritional value in the specific light and atmospheric conditions of a spacecraft, or microorganisms that can extract and recycle rare elements that might otherwise be lost from the system. The paper outlined short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals for synthetic biology and space exploration. Short-term applications include engineered microorganisms for more efficient waste processing. Mid-term goals involve plants optimized for spacecraft environments. Long-term visions include entire engineered ecosystems designed from the ground up for maximum efficiency and closure in space habitats. But genetic engineering introduces its own risks. What if an engineered organism mutates in unexpected ways under constant radiation exposure? What if it outcompetes other essential organisms in your closed ecosystem, disrupting the balance? What if you introduce an engineered organism that seems perfect during testing, but causes unforeseen problems 50 or 100 years into the mission? When you're completely isolated in deep space with no possibility of resupply, caution is essential. There's also the question of system resilience and redundancy. On Earth, ecosystems are incredibly resilient because they're so diverse. If one species fails, others fill that ecological niche. But on a generation ship, you're working with a deliberately simplified, engineered ecosystem. Simplicity makes it easier to control and predict, but it also makes it more fragile. If a key species in your system crashes, do you have backup organisms that can perform the same function? This is why most current generation ship designs include multiple redundant systems. You might have a primary bioregenerative system handling 90% of your life support needs, a secondary bioregenerative system as backup, and physicochemical systems as a third layer of redundancy. That way, if your primary agricultural section experiences a crop failure, you have time to recover without people starving. Now, let's talk about artificial gravity, because this is where the physics gets really cool and the engineering gets really terrifying. You've probably seen those classic science fiction images of rotating space stations, giant wheels or cylinders spinning through the void. It looks beautiful, almost peaceful. But creating and maintaining artificial gravity for centuries is one of the most mechanically complex challenges of generation ship design. Here's why we need artificial gravity in the first place. Human bodies evolved under Earth's gravity for hundreds of millions of years. Every system in your body, from your cardiovascular system to your vestibular system to your bones and muscles, expects to experience that constant downward pull. When you remove gravity, everything starts going wrong. Astronauts on the International Space Station experience bone density loss of about 1 to 2% per month in weight-bearing bones. That's 12 to 24% per year. Their muscles atrophy because they don't need to work as hard to move. Fluids shift toward the head, causing facial puffiness and vision problems. The heart doesn't have to pump as hard against gravity, so it weakens. The immune system becomes compromised. Even wound healing is affected. For a 6-month mission, astronauts can recover most of these losses after returning to Earth with proper rehabilitation. But for people living their entire lives in microgravity, for children conceived, born, and raised without ever experiencing gravity, the research suggests it would be catastrophic. Bones would be so weak they'd fracture from minimal stress. Muscles wouldn't develop properly. The cardiovascular system would be inadequate for any environment with gravity, meaning those people could never visit the destination planet even after the ship arrives. So generation ships need artificial gravity, and the only practical way to create it with current physics is through rotation. When a spacecraft spins, centrifugal force pushes objects toward the outer edge. Stand on the inner surface of that outer edge, and it feels like gravity pulling you down. The faster the rotation and the larger the radius, the stronger the artificial gravity. Here's the critical equation. The strength of artificial gravity depends on the rotation rate and the radius of the spacecraft. To create Earth-like gravity, 1G, you have several options. You could have a small radius and spin very fast, or a large radius and spin more slowly. But there's a catch. If you spin too fast, you create serious problems for the people inside. Imagine you're standing in a rotating spacecraft with a small radius, say 50 meters. To generate 1G of artificial gravity at that radius, the ship would need to rotate about 13 times per minute. That's extremely fast. Your head and your feet would experience noticeably different forces because they're at different distances from the center of rotation. This creates a gravity gradient that's deeply disorienting. When you move your head quickly, Coriolis forces would make you feel dizzy and nauseous. Walking would feel bizarre because each step would involve complex Coriolis effects. Research on human tolerance to rotation suggests that for long-term habitation, you want to keep the rotation rate below about 2 revolutions per minute to avoid these disorienting effects. At 2 RPM, to generate 1G of artificial gravity, you need a radius of about 224 meters. That means your ship needs to be at least 448 meters in diameter. And realistically, to be comfortable for people spending their entire lives aboard, you probably want to go even larger, maybe a radius of 400 or 500 meters, rotating at 1 or 1.5 RPM. Now we're talking about truly enormous structures. A generation ship with a 500-meter radius would be a kilometer across. To put that in perspective, that's about the length of 3 Empire State Buildings laid end to end. And this isn't a solid structure, it's a rotating spacecraft that needs to maintain structural integrity while spinning continuously for 250 years or more. The mechanical challenges of this are staggering. First, you need to get the ship spinning in the first place. In space, there's no friction, so once you start something spinning, it keeps spinning. That's good, but initiating that spin requires enormous amounts of energy, and it has to be done carefully to avoid creating stress fractures in the structure. Then you need to maintain that rotation at a constant rate. If the rotation speed changes even slightly, everyone on board experiences changing gravity, which would be disorienting and potentially dangerous. But maintaining constant rotation is harder than it sounds because of something called conservation of angular momentum. Anything that moves within the ship affects the ship's rotation. When people walk in the direction of rotation, they're adding angular momentum to the ship, which would slow the rotation slightly. When they walk against the rotation, they speed it up slightly. Water flowing through pipes, air moving through ventilation systems, equipment being transported, all of it affects the rotation rate. The ship needs active systems constantly making tiny adjustments to maintain stability. Some designs use counter-rotating sections to balance these effects. Imagine 2 cylinders rotating in opposite directions connected by a central hub. When mass moves in one section affecting its rotation, you can compensate by moving mass in the counter-rotating section. It's elegant physics, but it doubles the mechanical complexity. And here's something that keeps engineers awake at night: bearings. If you have counter-rotating sections or a rotating section connected to a non-rotating hub, You need bearings to allow that rotation. Those bearings have to support enormous loads while allowing smooth rotation with minimal friction, and they have to do this perfectly for centuries without failure. On Earth, we lubricate bearings and replace them when they wear out. On a generation ship in deep space, you don't have the luxury of replacement parts beyond what you brought with you. Some designs propose magnetic bearings, where the rotating sections are held in place by magnetic fields without physical contact, eliminating friction and wear. But magnetic bearings require constant power and sophisticated control systems. If the power fails, the sections could come into contact with catastrophic results. The structural integrity of a rotating spacecraft is another enormous challenge. When a structure spins, every part of it experiences centrifugal force trying to tear it apart. The faster it spins and the larger it is, the stronger these forces become. The outer hull of a 500-meter radius ship rotating at 1.5 RPM would experience significant stress. You need materials that are incredibly strong yet light enough to be practical for a spacecraft. Current designs often propose using carbon composites or advanced alloys, materials with high strength-to-weight ratios. But here's the problem. These materials have to maintain their properties for centuries while being bombarded by radiation, experiencing thermal cycling as different parts of the ship face toward or away from any nearby stars, and dealing with micrometeorite impacts. Materials science suggests that most structural materials degrade over time, especially in the harsh environment of space. Radiation makes materials brittle. Metals can experience radiation-induced embrittlement, where atomic-level damage accumulates over decades, making the material more likely to crack. Composites can delaminate. Welds and joints are particularly vulnerable. A tiny crack that forms 50 years into the mission might propagate slowly over the next century until it causes a catastrophic structural failure. This means the ship needs constant monitoring and repair capabilities. Sensors throughout the structure continuously checking for stress, deformation, cracks, any sign of structural degradation. Repair crews with the training and equipment to fix problems before they become critical, and the resources to make those repairs, which brings us back to the closure problem. Every rivet, every weld, every structural patch requires materials. Where do those materials come from on a ship that left Earth centuries ago? Some generation ship designs include manufacturing capabilities, essentially mobile factories that can process raw materials and create replacement parts. But what raw materials? You could potentially recycle damaged components, melting them down and reforming them. But that requires energy, sophisticated equipment, and technical knowledge that has to be preserved across generations. There's also the question of balance. A rotating spacecraft needs to be perfectly balanced around its axis of rotation. If mass isn't distributed evenly, the ship wobbles, creating oscillating forces that stress the structure and make life uncomfortable for the inhabitants. On Earth, you can balance a rotating object once and be done with it. On a generation ship, mass is constantly shifting, people move around, water and air circulate, agriculture grows and is harvested, equipment is relocated. The ship needs systems to continuously monitor the mass distribution and make corrections. This might involve pumping water between balance tanks, moving supplies, or relocating equipment. It sounds simple, but coordinating this for a kilometer-wide structure over centuries requires sophisticated automation and constant vigilance. Let's talk about the connection between the rotating and non-rotating parts of the ship, because many designs include both. The rotating habitat section provides artificial gravity for the crew, but some systems might be more practical in a non-rotating section. For example, telescopes and communication arrays work better when they're not spinning. Solar panels or radiators might be more efficient in non-rotating configurations. Fuel or cargo might be stored in a non-rotating central spine. This means you need a pressurized connection between the rotating and non-rotating sections, a space station equivalent of a rotating door. People and materials need to be able to move between sections. This connection point experiences enormous mechanical stress and has to maintain a perfect seal against the vacuum of space while allowing rotation. It's one of the most critical and vulnerable points in the entire ship. Then there's the question of power. A generation ship requires enormous amounts of power continuously for centuries. Power for life support systems, for lighting the agricultural areas, for maintaining temperature control, for running the computers and automation systems, for the manufacturing facilities, for everything. Where does this power come from? Solar panels are impractical once you're far from the sun. Beyond the orbit of Mars, solar intensity drops off dramatically. By the time you're in deep interstellar space, solar power is essentially useless. Some designs propose nuclear fission reactors using uranium or plutonium to generate power. The advantage is that nuclear fuel is incredibly energy-dense. A relatively small amount of fuel can power the ship for decades. The disadvantage is that nuclear reactors require maintenance, produce radioactive waste, and have limited fuel supplies even with the most efficient designs. Nuclear fusion is the dream power source for generation ships. Fusion reactors would be far more efficient than fission, producing enormous amounts of energy from hydrogen isotopes with minimal radioactive waste. But despite decades of research, we still don't have working fusion reactors that produce more energy than they consume. The latest research suggests we're getting closer, with experiments like ITER making progress, but a reliable fusion reactor that can run continuously for centuries remains theoretical. Some more exotic designs propose antimatter power or even using interstellar hydrogen as fuel, scooping it up as the ship travels and using it for fusion. These concepts are fascinating but require technology far beyond our current capabilities. For a generation ship launching in the foreseeable future, nuclear fission is probably the only realistic option, which means carrying enough fuel for the entire journey and dealing with the waste products for centuries. Thermal management is another challenge that doesn't get enough attention. Every system on the ship produces heat. The power reactors produce heat. The people produce heat. The agricultural systems produce heat. Electronic equipment produces heat. In the vacuum of space, getting rid of heat is surprisingly difficult because you can't rely on convection like you can in an atmosphere. Heat can only be radiated away. This means the ship needs massive radiators, panels that can radiate excess heat into space. These radiators need to be large enough to handle all the waste heat the ship produces. And here's the tricky part. Radiators work better when they're cold, but they also need to be protected from radiation and micrometeorite impacts, which might require shielding that reduces their efficiency. It's another delicate balance in a system full of delicate balances. Let's shift gears from the mechanical and biological to something equally critical but far more unpredictable: the human mind and human society. You can engineer perfect life support system, build indestructible structures, and solve every technical challenge. But if the society aboard the ship collapses, the mission fails just as surely as if the hull breached. Think about this for a moment. You're born on a generation ship. You've never seen Earth except in videos and photographs. You've never felt rain on your face, never walked through a forest, never seen an ocean. Your entire world is corridors and chambers inside a rotating metal cylinder. You know intellectually that you're traveling to a distant planet, but you also know with absolute certainty that you will never see it. Your children won't see it. Maybe your grandchildren won't either. You're living your entire life in transit for a goal you'll never personally experience. What does that do to a person? What does that do to a society? These aren't just philosophical questions. They're critical mission parameters that could determine whether a generation ship survives or descends into chaos. Psychologists who study isolated and confined environments, like Antarctica research stations or submarine crews, have identified numerous psychological challenges that emerge during long-duration isolation. Depression, anxiety, interpersonal conflicts, motivation loss, these all become more pronounced the longer people remain isolated. And we're talking about isolation measured in months or maybe a year or two. A generation ship involves isolation measured in centuries. One of the most fascinating psychological challenges is what researchers call the purpose paradox. The original crew that leaves Earth has clear purpose and motivation. They volunteered for this mission. They understand they're pioneers, making sacrifices so that their distant descendants can reach a new world. That sense of purpose can sustain people through incredible hardships. But what about the second generation? The children born on the ship? They didn't choose this. They were born into a situation they have no control over. Their entire lives are constrained by decisions made before they existed. Research suggests that finding meaning and purpose is essential for psychological health. On Earth, people find purpose in countless ways: careers, relationships, creative pursuits, contributing to their communities, exploring the world around them. On a generation ship, options are far more limited. You can't change careers on a whim because the ship needs specific roles filled. You can't travel to new places because there are no new places to visit. The world is literally the same metal walls you've seen every day of your life. Some generation ship designs address this by building in as much variety and beauty as possible. Parks and green spaces within the habitats, art galleries, performance spaces, architectural diversity so different areas of the ship feel distinct. Virtual reality systems that can simulate Earth environments or imaginary worlds, giving people psychological escape from the confines of the ship. These aren't luxuries, they're necessities for long-term psychological health. But there's a deeper challenge that's even more difficult to address. The knowledge that your entire existence is fundamentally transient and instrumental. You exist to keep the ship running, to raise the next generation who will keep the ship running, who will raise the generation after that. You're a link in a chain, and from a certain perspective, you're not even the important link. The important people are those who will eventually reach the destination generations after you're gone. That's a difficult philosophical burden to carry. It requires a cultural framework that values the journey itself, not just the destination. Societies on generation ships would need to develop philosophies and belief systems that provide meaning to lives lived entirely in transit. Maybe they'd develop new religions or spiritual practices centered on the voyage. Maybe they'd create cultural traditions that celebrate each generation's contribution to the ongoing mission. Maybe they'd emphasize the inherent value of life and community regardless of location. Project Hyperion explicitly required design teams to consider how society would function over multiple generations. How do you maintain social cohesion? How do you prevent the formation of harmful power structures? How do you ensure that knowledge and skills are passed down reliably? How do you handle conflict resolution when there's literally nowhere for people to go to escape each other? Social structure becomes critical. On Earth, if you don't like your community, you can move. If you fundamentally disagree with how your society operates, you can emigrate to another country. On a generation ship, you're stuck with everyone else for life. There's no escape valve for social pressure. This means the society needs robust conflict resolution mechanisms, fair governance systems, and cultural norms that prioritize cooperation and tolerance. Many proposed generation ship social structures involve some form of distributed governance where different communities within the ship have autonomy over their local affairs but coordinate on ship-wide issues. Think of it like a federation. This allows for some diversity in how people live while maintaining overall mission cohesion. Some areas of the ship might have different cultural practices, different social norms, even different languages, as long as they maintain the essential systems and don't interfere with the overall mission. But here's a scary scenario that keeps sociologists awake at night. What if a future generation simply decides they don't want to continue the mission? Imagine you're part of the fifth generation on a 250-year voyage. You've lived your whole life on this ship. Your ancestors left Earth 200 years ago. The destination planet is still 50 years away, which means you personally will never see it. Your children probably won't either. Why should you care? Why should you maintain systems for a goal you'll never experience? Why not just say, we're stopping here, even though here is empty interstellar space? This is called the Mutiny problem in generation ship literature, and it's genuinely concerning. The original mission plan means nothing if future generations reject it. You can't force people hundreds of years in the future to continue a journey their ancestors started. They have to be convinced, culturally and philosophically, that the mission matters. One approach is to make the ship itself psychologically valuable to the inhabitants, to create a culture where the ship is home, not just a vehicle. If people genuinely love living on the ship, if they've developed rich cultures and communities there, they're more likely to maintain it properly and continue the mission out of respect for their ancestors and responsibility to their descendants. Education becomes absolutely critical. Every generation needs to understand the mission, the destination, how the ship's systems work, and why maintaining those systems matters. But education on a generation ship faces unique challenges. You're not just teaching history and science, you're preserving the entire knowledge base of human civilization in a population of maybe 1,000 people. Think about how specialized modern knowledge is. On Earth, we have millions of experts across thousands of fields. No single person understands everything, but collectively humanity knows an incredible amount. On a generation ship, you have a tiny fraction of that population. You can't have 1,000 different specialists because you only have 1,000 people total, and many of them are children or elderly. You need people with broad, practical knowledge rather than deep specialization. This creates a knowledge preservation challenge. How do you maintain detailed technical knowledge about systems that might not need repair for decades? If the fusion reactor runs perfectly for 80 years, you might have 2 or 3 generations born and raised who never need to repair it. But if it fails in year 81, does anyone still remember how to fix it? Did the knowledge get passed down effectively? Digital storage seems like an obvious solution. Store all technical manuals, scientific knowledge, cultural archives, everything humanity knows in massive databases. But digital storage has its own fragility. Hard drives fail, solid-state memory degrades, cosmic radiation can corrupt data. You need multiple redundant backup systems, and you need people who understand how to maintain those systems across generations. Some designs propose including physical books as the ultimate backup. Paper, properly stored in controlled environments, can last for centuries. If all electronic systems fail, physical books remain readable. But books take up space and mass, both of which are at a premium on a spacecraft. It's yet another trade-off in a mission full of trade-offs. There's also the challenge of language drift. Languages evolve constantly. English today is noticeably different from English 100 years ago, and wildly different from English 500 years ago. On a generation ship isolated from Earth, the language would evolve in unique directions. After 10 generations, would people still be able to read the original technical manuals? Would they even speak a language that someone from Earth could understand? Some linguists suggest creating a standardized technical language specifically for the mission, a simplified, controlled language used for all technical documentation and education. This language would be artificially maintained to prevent drift. It's similar to how Latin was maintained as a scholarly language in Europe for centuries, even as spoken languages evolved around it. Genetic diversity presents another sociological challenge wrapped in biology. With a starting population of 500 to 1,500 people, genetic diversity is limited compared to Earth's billions. To prevent inbreeding and maintain genetic health across generations, the society needs some form of reproductive planning. This gets ethically complicated very quickly. On Earth, people generally have freedom to choose their partners and decide whether to have children. But on a generation ship, unrestricted reproductive choices could lead to genetic bottlenecks or population booms that exceed the ship's carrying capacity. Some level of guidance or regulation seems necessary, but how do you implement that without creating an oppressive society? Some proposed solutions involve genetic counseling, where people are informed about genetic compatibility and encouraged, but not forced, to make choices that benefit the overall population's genetic health. Others propose maintaining genetic material banks, storing frozen embryos or genetic samples from the original population that can be used to introduce genetic diversity in later generations. Advanced societies might use genetic engineering to actively maintain diversity and eliminate harmful mutations, but any reproductive regulation raises profound ethical questions. Who decides who can have children and with whom? What happens if someone violates the regulations? On Earth, we can debate these issues endlessly. On a generation ship where the survival of the entire population genuinely depends on maintaining genetic diversity, abstract ethics crash into practical necessity. Mental health services become absolutely essential. In a confined, isolated environment with limited privacy and constant social pressure, mental health challenges will be common. Depression, anxiety, trauma from accidents or personal losses, interpersonal conflicts that escalate, all of these need to be addressed by trained professionals. But training those professionals across generations, when mental health knowledge itself is evolving, presents challenges. Physical health is equally critical. The ship needs medical facilities and trained doctors across all specialties. But how do you train a surgeon when there might only be one surgeon on the entire ship? On Earth, surgeons train by performing thousands of procedures. On a small population ship, there simply aren't enough patients to maintain surgical skills through practice. Medical training would rely heavily on simulation and virtual reality, with doctors practicing procedures in simulated environments to maintain their skills. Genetic diseases present a particular challenge. On Earth's large population, rare genetic disorders affect relatively few people. But in a small population with limited genetic diversity, harmful recessive genes can become concentrated. If the founding population happens to carry genes for certain disorders, Those disorders could become tragically common in later generations. Advanced genetic screening and potential gene therapy might be necessary to manage this. Then there's the challenge of accidents and disasters. On Earth, if a fire destroys a hospital, other hospitals can provide care. If a pandemic strikes one region, other regions can send aid. On a generation ship, there's no outside help. A major disaster, a fire, a radiation leak, a crop failure, has to be managed with only the resources available on the ship. The society needs robust emergency response systems and enough redundancy that no single disaster can cripple essential services. Imagine you're standing on the command deck of a generation ship, looking out at the absolute emptiness of interstellar space. There are no landmarks, no road signs, no GPS satellites. The nearest star is so far away that even traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, it would take decades to reach. And here's the terrifying part. You're not just traveling through empty space, you're traveling through space that's moving. The stars are moving, the galaxy is rotating, everything is in motion relative to everything else. And you need to navigate through this cosmic ocean with such precision that after traveling for 250 years, you arrive exactly where you intended. This is the navigation challenge of generation ships, and it's unlike anything we've ever attempted as a species. Let's break down why this is so monumentally difficult. First, let's talk about the distances involved. The nearest star system to Earth is Alpha Centauri, about 4.37 light-years away. That's approximately 41 trillion kilometers. If you could somehow drive there in a car going 100 kilometers per hour without ever stopping, it would take about 47 million years. Even traveling at 10% the speed of light, which would require technology we don't currently possess, the journey would take 43 years. Other potentially habitable star systems are much farther. Proxima Centauri b, an exoplanet in the habitable zone of Proxima Centauri, is 4.24 light-years away. TRAPPIST-1, a system with multiple potentially habitable planets, is about 39 light-years away. That's 369 trillion kilometers. At 10% light speed, that's a 390-year journey. Now you might think navigation is simple. Point the ship at your destination and go. But space doesn't work that way. Your destination star isn't stationary. It's moving through the galaxy at its own velocity. The sun is also moving, carrying Earth and your launch point with it. You're not aiming for where the star is now. You're aiming for where it will be when you arrive, decades or centuries from now. This is like trying to hit a moving target with an arrow, except the target is trillions of kilometers away, moving at hundreds of kilometers per second, and your arrow takes centuries to arrive. The math involved is staggering. You need to calculate the current positions and velocities of both your starting point and destination, account for gravitational influences from nearby stellar objects, and plot a course that brings you to your destination at the exact time and place where the star will be. Here's where it gets even more complicated. As you travel, your trajectory will be affected by the gravitational fields of objects you pass. A massive star several light-years away still exerts gravitational influence. Dense regions of interstellar gas create drag. Your course will drift over decades and centuries. This means you can't just set a course and forget it. You need to constantly measure your position and velocity, compare them to your intended trajectory, and make course corrections. But how do you measure your position in interstellar space? On Earth, we use GPS satellites that triangulate our position based on radio signals. In near-Earth space, we use tracking stations on the ground. But in deep interstellar space, you're too far away for those systems to work. Radio signals from Earth would take years to reach you. and with every passing year, they get weaker until they're indistinguishable from background radiation. This is where pulsars become incredibly valuable. Pulsars are rapidly rotating neutron stars that emit beams of electromagnetic radiation with extraordinarily precise periods. Some pulsars rotate hundreds of times per second, and their rotation rates are so stable they rival atomic clocks in precision. Each pulsar has a unique rotation signature, like a cosmic lighthouse with its own identifying flash pattern. By observing multiple pulsars and measuring the arrival times of their pulses, you can triangulate your position in three-dimensional space. This is similar to how GPS works, but instead of satellites orbiting Earth, you're using dead stars scattered across the galaxy. NASA actually demonstrated this technology with the NICER experiment on the International Space Station, successfully using pulsar signals for navigation. The Voyager Golden Record, carried by both Voyager spacecraft launched in 1977, includes a pulsar map showing Earth's location relative to 14 specific pulsars. The map uses the pulsars' periods and positions to create a kind of cosmic coordinate system. A generation ship would use similar principles, but in real time, constantly measuring pulsar signals to determine its position and velocity. However, pulsar navigation has limitations. Pulsar signals are extremely weak, requiring sensitive radio telescopes to detect. The ship needs to maintain and calibrate these telescopes across centuries. Pulsars also slow down gradually over time, changing their rotation periods. This slowdown is predictable and can be accounted for, but it adds another layer of complexity to the calculations. Star positions provide another navigation reference. By measuring the precise positions of distant stars relative to each other, you can determine your position and orientation in space. This is similar to how ancient mariners used stars to navigate Earth's oceans, but far more precise. The Gaia spacecraft, launched by the European Space Agency in 2013, has mapped the positions and motions of over 1 billion stars with unprecedented precision. This data would be invaluable for generation ship navigation, but here's a subtle problem: parallax. As you move through space, nearby stars appear to shift position relative to distant background stars. This is actually useful for measuring distances, but it also means that star positions you observe from your ship won't match the positions observed from Earth. The farther you travel, the more different the sky looks. Your navigation systems need to account for this, constantly updating their star charts based on your changing position. Course corrections require propulsion, and propulsion requires fuel. Every time you fire engines to adjust your trajectory, you're using precious fuel that you can't replenish. This means navigation needs to be incredibly precise from the start to minimize the number and magnitude of course corrections needed. Even tiny errors at the beginning of the journey can compound over decades into massive deviations that require enormous amounts of fuel to correct. Let's talk about the propulsion systems themselves, because keeping a generation ship moving and maneuverable for centuries is its own engineering nightmare. Most current generation ship concepts assume some form of continuous low-thrust propulsion or periodic acceleration phases followed by long coasting periods. Ion drives, which use electricity to accelerate ions to extremely high velocities, provide very efficient but low thrust. They can run for years or decades on relatively small amounts of fuel, gradually accelerating the ship to high velocities. NASA's Dawn mission, which explored the asteroid Vesta and the dwarf planet Ceres, used ion propulsion successfully, but Dawn was a small robotic spacecraft. Scaling ion drives up to push a generation ship with its enormous mass would require massive power generation and fuel supplies, nuclear pulse propulsion, conceptualized in Project Orion back in the 1950s and 60s, involves detonating nuclear bombs behind the ship and riding the shockwave. It sounds insane, but the physics actually works. It could potentially accelerate a massive ship to a significant fraction of light speed. The challenge is that you need thousands of nuclear devices and a massive shock-absorbing system to protect the ship from the repeated explosions. It's also politically and environmentally problematic to launch a ship carrying thousands of nuclear weapons. Fusion drives remain theoretical but promising. If we can develop working fusion reactors, using them for propulsion would provide enormous thrust with relatively high efficiency. The ITER project, an international collaboration building a massive experimental fusion reactor in France, has been making progress towards sustainable fusion. But we're still decades away from compact, reliable fusion reactors suitable for spacecraft. More exotic concepts include antimatter propulsion, which would provide incredible energy density and efficiency, but antimatter is extraordinarily difficult and expensive to produce and store. Bussard ramjets, proposed in the 1960s, would scoop up interstellar hydrogen and use it for fusion fuel, theoretically allowing unlimited range. But the Ramos coupe would need to be enormous, potentially hundreds of kilometers across, and creating the magnetic fields to funnel hydrogen into the engines would require enormous power. Whatever propulsion system is used, it needs to function reliably for the entire journey. Engines that run for decades without maintenance, fuel that remains stable for centuries, control systems that can make precise adjustments to thrust over timescales longer than human lifetimes. And all of this needs to work in the hostile environment of space, with radiation, temperature extremes, and micrometeorite impacts. Communication presents challenges that are almost poetic in their difficulty. When the generation ship launches, it can communicate with Earth using radio or laser communications. The crew can receive updates from home, send back data and messages, maintain a connection to humanity's origin. But as the ship travels farther from Earth, communication becomes increasingly difficult. Radio signals travel at the speed of light, which sounds fast until you're dealing with interstellar distances. A signal from a ship 4 light-years away takes 4 years to reach Earth. The response takes another 4 years to return. That's an 8-year round-trip communication time. Have a question about a technical problem? Ask Earth and wait 8 years for an answer. By the time the answer arrives, your situation may have changed completely, and it gets worse as the ship travels farther. At 10 light-years from Earth, it's a 20-year round trip. At 20 light-years, 40 years. After a few decades of travel, the communication delay becomes so long that meaningful back-and-forth conversation with Earth becomes impossible. You're limited to sending status updates and receiving information broadcasts, with years or decades between transmission and reception. The signal's strength also decreases dramatically with distance. Radio signals spread out as they travel, following the inverse square law. Double the distance, and the signal becomes 1/4 as strong. At interstellar distances, signals from Earth would be incredibly weak, requiring enormous receivers and powerful transmitters to maintain communication. The ship would need massive antenna arrays and significant power dedicated to communications. There's also the problem of interference. The interstellar medium isn't empty. It contains gas, dust, and plasma that can scatter and absorb radio waves. The galaxy produces background radio noise from various sources. The farther the ship travels, the more interference builds up between the ship and Earth, making weak signals even harder to detect. Eventually, probably within a few decades of launch, the ship effectively becomes isolated from Earth. Communication might still be technically possible, but with delays measured in decades and signals so weak they're barely detectable, the practical ability to maintain a meaningful connection disappears. The ship and its inhabitants are on their own, truly alone in a way that no humans have ever been before. This isolation has profound implications. If the ship encounters an unexpected problem, there's no calling home for help. If Earth makes a breakthrough discovery relevant to the mission, by the time the ship receives the information, it might be too late to implement it. If something catastrophic happens to Earth, the ship might not find out for decades or centuries. Now we need to talk about one of the most insidious and persistent threats to a generation ship: radiation. When most people think about the dangers of space, they imagine dramatic catastrophes like hull breaches or asteroid collisions. But radiation is the silent killer, the invisible threat that's constantly bombarding the ship and everyone aboard it every second of every day for centuries. Let me paint a picture of just how hostile the radiation environment of deep space really is. On Earth, we're protected by two incredible shields, our atmosphere and our magnetic field. The atmosphere absorbs most cosmic radiation before it reaches the surface. The magnetosphere, Earth's magnetic field, deflects charged particles from the solar wind and cosmic rays, creating a protective bubble around the planet. We're so well protected that most people go through their entire lives never thinking about cosmic radiation. Step outside that protection, and the situation changes dramatically. In low Earth orbit, where the International Space Station operates, astronauts receive radiation doses about 10 times higher than on Earth's surface. They're still partially protected by Earth's magnetic field, and they pass through the thickest part of the atmosphere periodically. But they receive enough radiation that their cancer risk increases measurably, especially on longer missions. Travel beyond Earth's magnetic field into deep space, and the radiation environment becomes far worse. The Apollo astronauts who traveled to the Moon were the only humans to ever venture beyond Earth's magnetosphere. They were exposed to the full force of cosmic radiation, though their missions were short enough that their total radiation dose remained within acceptable limits. A few days or weeks in deep space is manageable. Decades or centuries is a completely different challenge. There are several sources of radiation in deep space that a generation ship needs to contend with. First, there's galactic cosmic radiation, or GCRs. These are high-energy particles, primarily protons and atomic nuclei, that originate from outside our solar system. They're produced by supernovae, neutron stars, black holes, and other violent cosmic events. GCRs travel at nearly the speed of light and have enormous energies. When they strike matter, they can penetrate deeply, causing ionization and radiation damage. The particularly nasty thing about GCRs is that they're very difficult to shield against. Low-energy radiation can be blocked with relatively thin shielding, but high-energy cosmic rays can punch through meters of material. In fact, when high-energy cosmic rays strike shielding material, they can produce secondary radiation through nuclear interaction, sometimes creating radiation showers that are more dangerous than the original particle. This means that naive shielding approaches, just adding more and more mass, can actually make the radiation problem worse beyond a certain point. Then there's solar cosmic radiation. Wait, you might say, a generation ship traveling to another star system is leaving the sun behind. Why would solar radiation matter? Well, for the first several years or even decades of the journey, while the ship is still within or near our solar system, the sun remains a significant radiation source. And here's the thing about solar radiation: it's unpredictable. The sun periodically releases enormous bursts of radiation and charged particles called solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These events can increase radiation levels by orders of magnitude for hours or days. On Earth, we're protected, but in space, a major solar event can deliver a lethal radiation dose to unprotected astronauts in a matter of hours. The August 1972 solar storm, which occurred between the Apollo 16 and 17 missions, would have been catastrophic if astronauts had been on the moon at the time. A generation ship needs to be designed to protect its inhabitants from both the constant background radiation of GCRs and the sporadic intense radiation from solar events during the early part of its journey. This requires multiple approaches to radiation protection. The most straightforward approach is mass shielding. Put enough material between the radiation source and the people you want to protect, and you can reduce radiation levels significantly. Water is actually one of the best shielding materials because it's rich in hydrogen, which is effective at absorbing radiation, and you need water aboard anyway for life support. Some generation ship designs arrange water tanks around the habitat areas, serving double duty as both life support storage and radiation shielding. Polyethylene and other hydrogen-rich plastics are also effective for radiation shielding. But here's the problem. To provide meaningful protection against GCRs, you need several meters of shielding material. Calculate the mass of water or polyethylene needed to surround a habitat module with 2 or 3 meters of shielding on all sides, and you're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of tons. Every kilogram of shielding is mass that needs to be launched from Earth and accelerated to cruise velocity, requiring enormous amounts of energy and fuel. Some designs propose using regolith, rock and soil, as shielding material. Instead of launching shielding from Earth, the ship would mine asteroids during the early part of its journey, collecting rock and using it as radiation protection. This is clever because rock is abundant in the solar system, and you're not paying the mass penalty of launching it from Earth. But it requires the ship to have mining and processing capabilities, which adds complexity and risk. Another approach is magnetic shielding, creating an artificial magnetosphere around the ship similar to Earth's natural protection. By generating powerful magnetic fields, you can deflect charged particles away from the ship before they reach the hull. This is elegant because magnetic fields have no mass, so they don't add to the ship's weight. But magnetic shielding has significant challenges. First, it requires enormous amounts of continuous power. You're maintaining magnetic fields strong enough to deflect high-energy particles across a volume large enough to encompass the entire ship. Some calculations suggest this could require megawatts of continuous power. Second, magnetic fields only deflect charged particles. They're useless against neutral particles like neutrons or gamma rays. Third, the magnetic fields themselves can be hazardous to humans if they're strong enough. You need to carefully design the field geometry to protect the habitat areas while keeping field strengths in those areas within safe limits for biological tissue and electronic equipment. Some advanced concepts propose using superconducting magnets to create magnetic shields more efficiently. Superconductors can carry enormous currents with zero resistance, potentially reducing the power requirements dramatically. But superconductors need to be kept at cryogenic temperatures, requiring sophisticated cooling systems that must operate flawlessly for centuries. There's also the possibility of electrostatic shielding, where the ship is surrounded by charged grids that repel incoming radiation. This faces similar challenges to magnetic shielding, enormous power requirements and limited effectiveness against certain types of radiation. Realistically, a generation ship would probably use a combination of approaches. Passive mass shielding for baseline protection, with the ship's structure, supplies, and water tanks arranged to provide maximum shielding to critical areas. Magnetic or electrostatic shielding as an active outer layer, reducing the radiation that reaches the passive shielding. And a dedicated storm shelter, a heavily shielded area where crew can retreat during periods of intense radiation like solar events. The storm shelter concept is particularly important. You can't shield the entire ship with meters of material without making it impossibly massive, but you can create a smaller, heavily shielded area where people can stay during radiation emergencies. During a solar storm or when passing through a region of space with unusually high radiation, everyone retreats to the shelter until the danger passes. But here's a subtle challenge. Radiation doesn't just harm people, it damages materials and equipment. Electronics are particularly vulnerable. Cosmic rays striking semiconductor chips can cause bit flips, where a 1 becomes a 0 or vice versa. In most cases, this is harmless, but if it happens in a critical system at a critical moment, it could cause malfunctions or failures. This is why spacecraft use radiation-hardened electronics, chips designed to resist radiation damage. These chips are made with special materials and designs that make them less susceptible to radiation-induced errors. But radiation-hardened electronics are expensive, heavier, and often less powerful than their commercial counterparts. And even radiation-hardened electronics degrade over time under constant radiation exposure. A generation ship would need extensive redundancy in its computer systems, with multiple backup computers running the same calculations and cross-checking their results to detect and correct radiation-induced errors. Critical systems would need to be shielded more heavily than habitat areas, and the ship would need replacement electronics stored in the most heavily shielded areas, protected until they're needed to replace degraded components. Structural materials also suffer radiation damage. Over years and decades of exposure, metals become brittle, their crystal structures disrupted by radiation. Plastics and composites degrade, their molecular bonds broken by energetic particles. This radiation-induced material degradation compounds the normal wear and tear from thermal cycling and mechanical stress we discussed earlier. The ship's outer hull, constantly exposed to the full force of cosmic radiation, would experience the most severe degradation. Some designs propose using sacrificial outer layers that are expected to degrade and be replaced periodically. The ship would carry spare hull panels stored in shielded areas, and repair crews would periodically replace the most degraded sections of the outer hull. Now let's talk about micrometeorites, because space isn't actually empty. The interstellar medium contains dust particles, tiny grains of rock and ice traveling at various velocities. When you're traveling through space at a significant fraction of the speed of light, even a grain of sand becomes a devastating projectile. Kinetic energy is 1/2 mass times velocity squared. When you double the velocity, you quadruple the energy. A grain of sand with a mass of 1 milligram, traveling at 10% the speed of light, hits with the energy of about a kilogram of TNT exploding. That's enough to punch through metal plating, vaporize material, and potentially breach the hull. And here's the terrifying part. You can't see these particles coming. They're too small to detect with telescopes until they're far too close to avoid. You're essentially flying blind through a cosmic shooting gallery, hoping you don't hit anything critical. Interstellar dust isn't densely packed. Space is still mostly empty, but over decades of travel across trillions of kilometers, the odds of impacts accumulate. Calculations suggest that a generation ship with a cross-sectional area of several thousand square meters, would experience numerous micrometeorite impacts during a multi-century journey. Protection against micrometeorites requires a different approach than radiation shielding. Instead of dense mass to absorb impacts, you want multiple layers with spacing between them. This is called a Whipple shield, invented by astronomer Fred Whipple. In the 1940s, the concept is elegant. The first layer, the bumper, is hit by the micrometeorite. The impact vaporizes both the particle and part of the bumper, creating a cloud of plasma and debris. This cloud expands as it travels toward the second layer. Because the debris cloud is much larger than the original particle, its energy is distributed over a larger area when it hits the second layer, reducing the penetration. Multiple layers can stop particles that would punch straight through a single solid plate of the same total thickness. The International Space Station uses Whipple shielding extensively. The habitat modules have multiple layers of protection with spacing between them. But the ISS is in low Earth orbit, where micrometeorite velocities are relatively low and the particle environment is somewhat predictable. A generation ship traveling at 10% of light speed faces far more energetic impacts in a less predictable environment. Some generation ship designs propose an expendable shield at the front of the ship, a large, relatively thin barrier positioned far ahead of the main structure. Micrometeorites hit this shield first, and the resulting debris cloud expands before reaching the main ship, reducing the impact energy. But maintaining this shield for centuries is challenging. Each impact damages it, and eventually it would be so degraded it would need to be replaced or repaired. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in science fiction, but is absolutely critical to the survival of a generation ship: spare parts. It sounds mundane compared to fusion reactors and interstellar navigation, but this is where the mission could genuinely fail in the most frustrating way possible. Not from a catastrophic explosion or alien attack, but because a critical valve broke and nobody had a replacement. Think about the technological challenge here. You're building a ship that needs to operate continuously for 250 years. 250 years ago from today, it was 1776. The United States had just declared independence. The steam engine was a recent invention. Electricity hadn't been harnessed yet. Now imagine if people in 1776 had needed to build a machine that would still be working today in 2026 with no possibility of resupply or outside help. That's the challenge facing generation ship designers. You need to anticipate every possible failure mode for every system on the ship, calculate how often components will fail based on centuries of operation, and carry enough spare parts to replace everything that will break. But you're limited by mass. You can't carry infinite spares. You need to make careful calculations about what to bring, in what quantities, and you need to be right because there's no going back for more. Let's start with something simple: bearings. Rotating machinery uses bearings to reduce friction. The ship's centrifuge spins constantly to provide artificial gravity. That rotation is supported by bearings. Even the best bearings wear out eventually. Metal surfaces sliding against each other, even with lubrication, gradually wear away. Lubricants themselves degrade over time, especially in the radiation environment of space. How many replacement bearings do you need for a centrifuge that will rotate continuously for 250 years? Engineers can calculate the expected lifespan of bearings under specific conditions, but those calculations involve uncertainties. Manufacturing variations mean some bearings fail sooner than expected. Unexpected vibrations or stress might accelerate wear. You need to carry extra bearings beyond the calculated minimum. But how many extra? Every additional bearing is mass that could be used for something else. Now multiply this problem across every single component on the ship. Pumps, valves, seals, filters, sensors, computer chips, wiring, structural fasteners, heat exchangers, motors. Every single part has a finite lifespan and will eventually need replacement. Making a complete inventory of spare parts for a generation ship is a monumental engineering task. Some components are particularly challenging. Complex electronic systems like computers and sensors might have lifespans measured in years or decades, not centuries. Radiation damage, thermal cycling, and simple aging will cause electronics to fail. The ship might need thousands of replacement computer modules over the course of the journey. But here's where it gets really tricky. Technology becomes obsolete. The computers installed when the ship launches will be cutting edge for that era, but within a few decades, they'll be hopelessly outdated compared to what's being developed on Earth. However, the ship's systems are designed around those specific computers. All the software interfaces and control systems expect that specific hardware. You can't just swap in a newer, better computer because the rest of the system won't know how to talk to it. This means you're locked into using obsolete technology for the entire journey. The ship needs to carry enough spare parts to maintain systems using technology that might be 50, 100, or 200 years old relative to contemporary Earth technology. One solution is to standardize components as much as possible. Instead of having 100 different types of sensors throughout the ship, use the same sensor type for every possible application. This reduces the variety of spares needed and increases the quantity of each type, improving your statistical odds that you have enough when needed. But standardization has limits. Different applications genuinely need different components. You can't use the same sensor to measure temperature, pressure, and radiation levels. Another approach is in situ manufacturing. Instead of carrying finished spare parts, carry raw materials and manufacturing equipment. When you need a replacement valve, you manufacture it on demand. This is incredibly mass efficient because raw materials can be used to make many different things, whereas a finished spare part can only replace that specific component. But in situ manufacturing for a generation ship requires an incredibly sophisticated industrial base. You need machine tools that can manufacture precision parts. You need smelting and refining equipment to process raw materials. You need 3D printers that can work with metals, ceramics, and polymers. You need quality control systems to ensure manufactured parts meet specifications. And all of this equipment needs to be maintained and operated by the crew across generations. Modern manufacturing relies on supply chains spanning the entire globe. A single smartphone contains materials and components from dozens of countries. A generation ship can't rely on supply chains. It needs to be industrially self-sufficient to an extent that no human society has ever achieved in such a confined space. Project Hyperion wrestling with this calculated that a generation ship would need a minimum industrial base capable of producing everything from simple metal parts to complex electronics. This requires multiple types of manufacturing equipment, raw material stockpiles, and most challenging of all, the knowledge and skills to use them effectively across generations. Imagine you're a machinist on a generation ship, trained to operate the manufacturing equipment. You need to pass your knowledge to the next generation, but what if the equipment doesn't break during your lifetime? The next generation might go their entire lives without needing to manufacture a particular type of part. By the third or fourth generation, does anyone still remember how to do it? Is the knowledge still being passed down effectively, or has it been lost? This is where detailed documentation becomes critical. Every manufacturing process needs to be documented in exhaustive detail, not just how to make a bearing, but every step, every tool setting, every quality check, everything a person would need to know to manufacture the part, even if they've never done it before. This documentation needs to be maintained and updated as manufacturing techniques are refined or equipment is modified. But documentation has its limits. There's knowledge that's difficult to capture in words or diagrams. Experienced machinists develop intuitions about how materials behave, how tools wear, when something sounds right or wrong. This tacit knowledge is traditionally passed down through apprenticeship, working alongside an experienced practitioner for years. On a generation ship with a limited population, maintaining these apprenticeship chains across centuries is challenging. Let's talk about materials degradation, because even parts sitting in storage don't last forever. Metals corrode, even in the controlled environment of a spacecraft. Plastics off-gas and become brittle over decades. Rubber seals harden and crack. Lubricants separate and lose their properties. Electronic components can fail even when not in use, victim to the slow march of chemical reactions and radiation damage. This means you can't just stockpile spare parts and assume they'll be good forever. Parts in storage need to be monitored, tested, and potentially replaced even before they're ever installed. Some materials might need to be stored in special conditions, cryogenic temperature, inert atmospheres, radiation shielding, to extend their shelf life. But special storage requires energy and adds complexity. Some materials simply can't be stockpiled effectively for centuries. Certain chemicals used in manufacturing or life support degrade too quickly. For these, the ship needs to carry raw materials and synthesis equipment to manufacture them as needed. But chemical synthesis requires detailed knowledge, specialized equipment, and often dangerous processes. Maintaining chemical manufacturing capability across generations is another knowledge preservation challenge. Radiation damage to materials is particularly insidious because it's cumulative and often invisible until catastrophic failure occurs. A metal component might look perfectly fine even as radiation has weakened its crystal structure. Years later, under stress, it suddenly fails. This means the ship needs regular inspection regimes, using non-destructive testing techniques like ultrasound, X-rays, and magnetic particle inspection to detect hidden damage before it causes failures. But here's a mind-bending challenge. How do you test critical components that can't be taken offline? The main reactor can't be shut down for disassembly and inspection because the ship needs continuous power. The centrifuge can't be stopped for weeks while bearings are inspected because people need continuous artificial gravity. You need inspection methods that work on operating equipment, and you need redundancy so that components can be rotated out of service for detailed inspection while backups take over. Software presents its own unique challenges. Unlike physical components that wear out, software doesn't degrade with use. But software has bugs, and complex software has many bugs. Some bugs might not manifest until specific rare conditions occur, which might not happen for decades. When a critical bug does appear, you need people who understand the software well enough to fix it. But software created at the time of launch will be written in programming languages, using paradigms and tools common to that era. 50 years into the journey, are there still programmers who understand those old languages and can modify that code? 100 years in? 200? Software knowledge needs to be actively maintained across generations, even if there's no immediate need for modifications. Some generation ship designs propose creating new software from scratch periodically, rewriting critical systems using current knowledge and tools available to that generation. This is risky because new software introduces new bugs, but it prevents the accumulation of technical debt where the software becomes so old and poorly understood that nobody can safely modify it. There's also the challenge of data storage over centuries. All the ship's technical documentation, scientific knowledge, cultural archives, everything needs to be stored in formats that remain accessible for hundreds of years. Digital storage media degrade, hard drives fail, flash memory loses charge, optical disks develop errors. Even if the media survive, file formats and encoding schemes become obsolete. Can you read a floppy disk from 1990? Most modern computers can't. Now extend that problem over centuries. The ship needs multiple redundant storage systems using different technologies to ensure that even if one system fails, others remain operational. Regular data migration, copying data to fresh storage media periodically, prevents loss from media degradation. Multiple format redundancy, storing the same information in different file formats, protects against format obsolescence. And critically, maintaining the knowledge of how to access and interpret the data across generations. Some propose including analog backups for the most critical information. Physical books, microfilm, even engraved metal plates with key technical diagrams and instructions. These have enormous longevity if properly stored, but they're bulky and have limited information density compared to digital storage. Power generation components face particularly severe challenges because they operate continuously under extreme conditions. A fusion reactor runs at incredible temperatures with intense radiation. A solar array, if used early in the journey, faces constant bombardment by solar radiation. Nuclear fission reactors have components that become intensely radioactive and embrittle over time. Reactor components need to be replaced periodically, but they're some of the most complex and dangerous components on the ship. Replacing reactor internals requires highly trained specialists working in high radiation environments, potentially using remote-controlled robots to minimize human exposure. The ship needs the capability to manufacture or carry spares for every reactor component that will wear out over the journey. Cooling systems are another critical vulnerability. Reactors, electronics, and habitats all generate heat that must be radiated into space. Radiators are typically large surfaces exposed to the space environment, making them vulnerable to micrometeorite impacts and radiation damage. A damaged radiator might leak coolant or simply become less efficient. The ship needs redundant radiator capacity and the ability to repair or replace damaged sections. Life support systems face continuous stress because they run constantly and handle complex chemistry. Filters clog and need replacement. Membranes degrade, catalysts lose efficiency, pumps wear out. Every component in the life support chain has a finite lifespan and needs spares. And because life support is critical to survival, it needs substantial redundancy. Not just spare parts in storage, but multiple parallel systems so that if one fails, others can take over immediately. Agricultural systems present unique challenges because they involve living organisms that can't simply be stored as spare parts. Crop seeds need to remain viable across generations. Genetic diversity in plants needs to be maintained. Beneficial microorganisms in the soil need to be preserved. This requires active maintenance of biological libraries, periodically growing and harvesting crops to refresh seed stocks, maintaining cultures of essential microorganisms. What happens if a disease wipes out a particular crop variety? The ship needs genetic diversity in its crops and the knowledge to breed new varieties if needed. This requires maintaining not just seeds, but genetic material in various forms and the biotechnology knowledge to work with it. Now we arrive at one of the most dramatic and dangerous phases of the entire mission: arrival. After 250 years of travel, crossing trillions of kilometers of space, navigating by dead stars and ancient star charts, the generation ship finally approaches its destination. This should be a moment of triumph, the culmination of centuries of sacrifice and perseverance. But it's actually when the mission faces some of its greatest risks. Let's start with the most fundamental challenge: deceleration. If your ship has been accelerating to 10% of light speed, it's now traveling at about 30,000 kilometers per second. That's fast enough to cross the distance from Earth to the Moon in about 13 seconds. At this velocity, the destination star system is approaching rapidly. And here's the problem: you need to slow down. Newton's laws are unforgiving. The same amount of energy required to accelerate the ship to cruise velocity is required to decelerate it back to orbital speeds. If you spent 50 years accelerating using a fusion drive, you need to spend another 50 years decelerating. This means you need to carry enough fuel not just for the acceleration phase, but for an equally long deceleration phase. In practice, this means carrying even more fuel than that, because during acceleration you're carrying all the fuel you'll need for deceleration, which adds mass, which requires more fuel to accelerate. This is why the rocket equation is so tyrannical. The mass ratio required for a high-speed interstellar mission with acceleration and deceleration is staggering. Some calculations suggest that for every kilogram of payload delivered to the destination, you might need 10,000 kilograms or more of fuel at launch. This is why most practical generation ship designs assume relatively modest velocities, perhaps 1 to 10% of light speed, and use highly efficient propulsion systems like fusion drives or even more speculative technologies. The timing of the deceleration burn is critical. Start too early and you waste fuel. Arrive at the star system, still traveling at interstellar velocities, and you can't stop, you'll shoot right through and out the other side. Your mission failed at the final moment. The deceleration burn needs to be planned and executed with extraordinary precision. But here's a challenge that compounds everything else. You don't know exactly what you're arriving at. When the mission launched from Earth 250 years ago, scientists chose the destination based on observations made from telescopes. They identified a star system with potentially habitable planets in the right temperature zone, with spectroscopic evidence suggesting water or suitable atmospheric composition. But all that data was collected from light years away, often with limited resolution. The images and spectra that convinced mission planners this destination was worth a 250-year journey might have been based on a few pixels of data from an exoplanet telescope or subtle wobbles in a star's position indicating planetary masses. Enormous scientific knowledge was extracted from incredibly sparse data. But sparse data means uncertainty. As the generation ship approaches the destination, it begins to gather much more detailed information. Telescopes aboard the ship, now only light months or light weeks from the target, can see things that Earth-based telescopes never could. And this is where the crew might discover that their destination isn't what they expected. Maybe the planet that looked habitable from Earth is actually tidally locked, with one side perpetually facing the star and the other in permanent darkness, creating extreme temperature gradients that make it less suitable. Maybe there's more volcanic activity than expected, filling the atmosphere with sulfur compounds. Maybe the magnetic field is weaker than thought, providing less protection from the star's radiation. Maybe there's an unexpected asteroid belt that makes approaching the planet dangerous, or perhaps the situation is even worse. Maybe there is no habitable planet. The signals that suggested a suitable world were misinterpreted, or the planet's orbit changed due to gravitational perturbations, or it was struck by a massive asteroid sometime in the centuries since Earth-based observations were made. Space operates on timescales both vast and immediate. A star system can remain stable for billions of years, but it can also be disrupted by events that unfold on human timescales. What does the crew do if they arrive and discover their destination is unsuitable? They've traveled for 250 years. They can't go back to Earth. The fuel is gone, and it would take another 250 years anyway. They could potentially alter course to a different nearby star system, but that requires more fuel and more time. The ship's systems, already stressed by 2 centuries of operation, need to continue functioning for potentially many more decades. This uncertainty is one of the strongest arguments for sending robotic probes ahead of generation ships. A small, fast probe could reach the destination years or decades before the main ship, survey the system in detail, and send back comprehensive data. If the destination proves unsuitable, the generation ship could alter course while still far enough away that the course correction doesn't require prohibitive fuel. But this assumes the probe survives the journey and functions properly after decades or centuries in transit. It assumes communication channels remain open despite the vast distances, and it assumes the generation ship has the flexibility to change destinations based on the probe's findings, which requires carrying extra fuel for such contingencies. Assuming the destination is suitable, the ship faces the challenge of actually establishing orbit around the target planet. After decelerating to more manageable velocities, perhaps a few tens or hundreds of kilometers per second, the ship needs to maneuver into a stable orbit. This requires precise burns of the positioning thrusters, careful navigation to avoid any moons or debris, and coordination that must account for the communication delay as different parts of the ship's systems report their status. The ship might initially enter orbit around the star itself, not the planet, while the crew conducts detailed surveys to select the best landing sites or orbital positions. During this phase, they're using instruments and sensors that have been in storage or limited use for most of the journey. These instruments need to function perfectly after centuries, which is far from guaranteed. Backups and redundancy are critical. Now, let's talk about what happens to the human population aboard during this arrival phase, because the social dynamics become incredibly complex. For generations, everyone aboard the ship has lived with a singular purpose: reach the destination. Society, culture, education, everything is oriented around this goal. Children are taught from birth that they're traveling to a new world, that their lives are part of this grand journey. But as arrival approaches, the reality sets in. Most of the people aboard will never set foot on the destination planet. The ship can't land. It's far too massive and not designed for atmospheric entry. Instead, smaller lander vehicles will ferry people and equipment to the surface, and there's a brutal calculus. The planet can only support so many people initially. It might take years or decades to establish infrastructure capable of supporting the ship's entire population. Who goes down to the surface first? The youngest and healthiest, who have the longest productive lives ahead of them. The most skilled engineers and scientists needed to establish infrastructure. The senior leadership who have been guiding the mission. People with specific genetic profiles that offer advantages for the destination's environment. Families selected through lottery to ensure fairness. Every selection criterion creates winners and losers, people who get to see the new world and people who might die in orbit before their turn comes. This is a recipe for social tension and conflict at exactly the moment when unity and cooperation are most needed. There's also the question of what happens to the ship itself. After spending 250 years as home to thousands of people, does the generation ship simply become obsolete? Some mission designs assume the ship will be dismantled, its materials and components cannibalized to build infrastructure on the surface or in orbit. This is mass efficient, using everything the ship carried for maximum benefit. But there's something profoundly sad about dismantling the ship that carried humanity across the stars. It's not just a vehicle, it's a home, a monument to human achievement, a piece of history. Some might argue it should be preserved as a museum, maintained in orbit as a testament to the journey. But preserving it requires ongoing energy and resources that could be used for the colony. It's a values judgment with no clear right answer. Then there's the challenge of actually establishing a colony on an alien world. Even if the planet is habitable, with breathable atmosphere, liquid water, and suitable temperature, it's still fundamentally alien. The biochemistry might be incompatible with Earth life. The soil might lack essential nutrients or contain toxic compounds. Native microorganisms, if they exist, might be harmful to humans or Earth crops. The colonists need to establish agriculture in an alien environment. They need to build habitats that protect them from any environmental hazards. They need to locate and exploit resources like metals, water, and energy sources. All of this while maintaining the social cohesion and technical knowledge that got them there in the first place. And here's a subtle but crucial point. The generation ship crew, after centuries in space, might not be well adapted to planetary life. Multiple generations have lived in artificial gravity, recycled air, and carefully controlled environments. They've never experienced weather, never walked on natural soil, never seen a horizon that isn't the curved wall of a habitat module. Physically, they might struggle with planetary gravity, even if it's similar to Earth's. Their immune systems have been isolated from the diversity of microorganisms that exist on planets. Psychologically, some might experience agoraphobia in the open environments of a planetary surface after generations in enclosed spaces. The transition from ship to planet is not just logistical, it's biological and psychological. There's also the question of reproduction and population management during and after arrival. If the ship's population has been carefully controlled during the journey to avoid overpopulation, what happens when arrival is imminent? Do you relax birth restrictions to increase the colonizing population, or maintain restrictions until you understand how many people the destination can support? If genetic diversity has been carefully managed during the journey using frozen embryos or genetic engineering, how is this extended to the colony? The founding population of the colony determines the genetic future of all subsequent generations on this new world. If it's too small or not diverse enough, genetic problems could plague the colony for centuries. Communication with Earth adds another fascinating dimension. Even if the generation ship left Earth 250 years ago and just now arrived at a star 10 light-years away, Earth is still there. Radio signals from the colony can still reach Earth, though with a 10-year time delay. And Earth has continued advancing during those 250 years. Imagine being a colonist, establishing yourself on a new world with technology that's cutting edge by the standards of 250 years ago. Then you receive transmissions from Earth, showing what they've accomplished in the intervening centuries. Maybe they've developed faster than light travel, and other colonies are arriving. Maybe they've solved aging and people on Earth live for hundreds of years. Maybe they've built megastructures around the sun, harnessing its entire energy output. How do you feel? Having sacrificed generations to reach this new world, only to discover Earth has advanced so far beyond you. There's a term for this, the incessant obsolescence problem. Any interstellar journey at sublight speeds risks being overtaken by future missions using better technology. The longer your journey takes, the more likely Earth develops something better that reaches your destination before you or shortly after. This could create profound psychological and cultural challenges for the colony. Do they maintain contact with Earth, constantly reminded of how far ahead the home world has advanced? Or do they intentionally cut contact, choosing to develop independently and avoid the psychological burden of comparison? Some science fiction has explored the idea that early generation ships might encounter later, faster ships that overtook them during the journey. Imagine being 5 generations into a 10-generation journey, and a ship launched a century after you passes by, waves and arrives at the destination decades before you. The psychological impact would be devastating. Let's talk about failure. Not the optimistic scenario where everything goes according to plan, but the realistic assessment of what happens when things go catastrophically wrong on a generation ship. Because over a 250-year journey through the most hostile environment imaginable, something will eventually go wrong. The question is whether the ship and its population can survive it. Start with the most immediate existential threat: catastrophic hull breach. A micrometeorite punches through the Whipple shielding, through the outer hull, and creates a hole in a pressurized habitat module. Air begins rushing out into the vacuum of space. Alarms scream. People have minutes, maybe seconds, to react. In this scenario, everything depends on compartmentalization. If the ship is designed as one giant pressurized volume, a single breach could depressurize the entire habitat, killing everyone aboard within minutes. This is why practical designs use multiple sealed compartments with airlocks between them. A breach in one compartment can be isolated by sealing the connecting hatches, sacrificing that section to save the rest. But compartmentalization creates its own problems. If a breach occurs in the agricultural section, you might save the crew by sealing it off, but now you've lost a significant portion of your food production. Can the remaining agricultural capacity feed everyone? If not, you're looking at rationing, potential starvation, and the need to somehow expand agricultural capacity in the remaining sections. What if the breach occurs in a residential section while people are inside? There might be only seconds to evacuate before the hatches must be sealed. Anyone who doesn't make it out is lost. The psychological trauma of abandoning people, hearing them pounding on the sealed hatches as the air runs out, would haunt the survivors for generations. This is why emergency pressure suits stationed throughout the ship are critical. Giving people precious extra minutes to evacuate, repairing a hull breach in deep space is extraordinarily dangerous. Someone needs to go outside into the vacuum, exposed to full cosmic radiation, and patch the hole. This requires spacewalks by crew members in spacesuits, working in conditions far more hazardous than anything faced by astronauts in Earth orbit. There's no emergency evacuation to Earth if something goes wrong. If a spacesuit fails, if a crew member becomes incapacitated, the consequences are immediate and fatal. The ship needs to carry hull repair materials, patches, sealants, welding equipment for exterior work, and the crew needs to maintain spacewalking expertise across generations. This is knowledge that might not be used for decades but must remain sharp, because when it's needed urgently and lives depend on it. Now consider a different failure mode: reactor malfunction. The fusion reactor or fission reactor providing the ship's power develops a serious problem. Maybe a coolant leak, maybe a control system failure, maybe radiation-induced damage to critical components. The reactor needs to be shut down for repairs, but the ship can't function without power. Life support stops. Heating stops. In the coldness of space, temperatures inside the ship begin dropping rapidly. The crew has hours, maybe days, before it becomes uninhabitably cold. This is why redundancy in power systems is absolutely critical. Most designs call for multiple reactors, each capable of providing baseline power even if not full operational capacity. If one reactor fails, others take over while repairs are made. But what if multiple reactors fail simultaneously? Perhaps a design flaw that wasn't apparent during testing, a type of radiation damage that affects all reactors the same way, or a cascade failure where one reactor's malfunction damages others. The ship might be left with only emergency batteries, providing power for essential systems but not everything. In this scenario, the crew faces brutal choices. Do you keep life support running but let the temperature drop to conserve power? Do you maintain the centrifuge to preserve artificial gravity or shut it down to save energy? Do you keep the agricultural systems alive or sacrifice future food production to keep people alive now? Every decision trades one vital need against another. Repairing reactors under these conditions is a nightmare. The damaged reactor might be intensely radioactive, requiring remote-operated robots for repairs. But if power is limited, you might not have energy to spare for running sophisticated robots. Crew might need to enter high radiation areas with minimal shielding, accepting doses that will dramatically shorten their lives, sacrificing themselves so others can survive. This is the calculus of survival on a generation ship. In the most dire emergencies, some people might need to volunteer for missions that are essentially suicidal, taking lethal radiation doses or venturing into compromised areas to save the rest of the population. The social and ethical implications are profound. How does a society function when it might periodically need volunteers for suicide missions? Let's consider biological catastrophe, a disease outbreak aboard the ship, perhaps a pathogen that was dormant in the human population and suddenly becomes active, perhaps a mutation in the ship's carefully controlled microbial ecosystem, perhaps something completely unexpected that emerges from the complex interactions of human biology, agricultural systems, and the radiation environment. In the enclosed environment of a generation ship, disease can spread rapidly. Everyone breathes the same recycled air, shares the same water system, lives in close proximity. A highly contagious pathogen could sweep through the entire population within days or weeks. And because the population is limited and carefully maintained for genetic diversity, a disease that kills even a significant minority could be catastrophic for the mission's long-term viability. The ship needs medical facilities capable of diagnosing and treating unknown diseases. It needs quarantine areas where sick individuals can be isolated. It needs medical knowledge preserved across generations, with trained doctors and medical researchers in every generation. And critically, it needs genetic and biological resources, frozen tissue samples, genetic engineering capabilities that might allow development of treatments for unexpected diseases. But medical knowledge evolves. The medical understanding available when the ship launched becomes outdated as Earth continues research. If communication with Earth is maintained, medical advances can be transmitted, but there's a time delay. A disease outbreak on the ship requires immediate response, not answers that arrive years later at the speed of light. There's also the possibility of psychological or social collapse. Imagine a generation where, through a combination of educational failures, social conflicts, and random chance, the crew loses critical knowledge or skills. Maybe the current generation of fusion reactor technicians trains the next generation inadequately. Maybe social upheaval disrupts the educational system. Maybe a charismatic leader convinces people that certain technical knowledge is unnecessary or dangerous. 1 or 2 generations of knowledge loss might be recoverable from documentation and training systems. But if the loss persists for multiple generations, the ship could find itself with systems it can no longer maintain or repair. The reactor technicians don't fully understand the reactor. The agricultural specialists don't grasp the complex chemistry they're supposed to monitor. The navigation specialists can't interpret the data their instruments provide. This is a slow-motion catastrophe. Systems continue functioning, perhaps for years or decades, maintained through routine procedures that people follow without fully understanding. But when something breaks in an unexpected way, when a new problem requires actual understanding rather than rote procedures, the crew might be helpless. They're operating equipment they don't truly comprehend, like medieval monks copying Latin texts they couldn't read. Recovery from this scenario requires recognizing the problem and implementing intensive education programs, possibly for multiple generations, to rebuild lost knowledge. But recognizing the problem requires someone understanding that knowledge has been lost, which is difficult if the knowledge loss is gradual and subtle. Computer system failures present another fascinating failure mode. The ship's computers control navigation, life support, power distribution, environmental monitoring, countless critical functions. These systems are presumably redundant and radiation-hardened. But what happens if there's a catastrophic software failure that affects multiple systems? Maybe a long-dormant bug in the code suddenly manifests when certain conditions align. Maybe radiation damage accumulates in memory systems, causing widespread data corruption. Maybe a malicious crew member, in a fit of psychological instability, sabotages critical software. The ship could lose navigation data, life support control, or even the ability to execute the deceleration burn at the destination. Recovery requires people who deeply understand the computer systems and can rebuild or repair damaged software and hardware. This is why maintaining programming expertise across generations is critical. But as we discussed, the programming languages and systems from the ship's launch era become increasingly archaic over the journey. There's also the possibility of navigational failure. The ship loses track of its position or velocity. Maybe the star tracking systems malfunction. Maybe accumulate errors in the inertial navigation system compound until position data is unreliable. Maybe a close encounter with an unexpected massive object, a rogue planet or brown dwarf, perturbs the ship's trajectory. Without accurate navigation, the ship might miss its destination entirely. Imagine arriving at the point where the target star system should be, only to discover you're off by hundreds of billions of kilometers. At interstellar scales, even small angular errors translate to enormous positional errors. The difference between arriving at the destination and missing it entirely could be a navigational error of less than 1 degree accumulated over decades of travel. Correcting navigational errors requires fuel for course corrections. If the error is discovered early, a small burn can fix it. But if the error isn't discovered until late in the journey, the course correction might require more fuel than the ship has remaining. The mission could fail within sight of its destination because of a navigational error made decades earlier. Let's talk about resource depletion. The ship's life support is designed to recycle everything, but no recycling system is perfect. Every cycle loses a small percentage of water, oxygen, nitrogen. Over decades and centuries, these small losses accumulate. The ship might find itself running low on essential resources with no way to replenish them. water loss is particularly serious. Water is needed for drinking, agriculture, hygiene, and radiation shielding. If water levels drop below critical thresholds, the crew faces impossible choices: reduce drinking water ration, cut back on agriculture, and accept reduced food production. Remove water from radiation shielding and accept higher radiation exposure. Some generation ship designs assume the ship can collect resources from the interstellar medium during flight. The tenuous hydrogen in interstellar space could theoretically be collected and used as fusion fuel or converted to water. But collecting diffuse interstellar hydrogen while traveling at high velocity requires enormous magnetic scoops extending for thousands of kilometers, and the engineering challenges are immense. Alternatively, the ship might plan stops at stellar systems along the way to collect resources. This extends the journey time dramatically and requires finding suitable systems on the route, but it allows resource replenishment. Of course, stopping and restarting requires fuel, which is itself a resource that might be in short supply. What about catastrophic population loss? A disease, an accident, a cascade of failures kills a large fraction of the population. Suddenly, the ship has far fewer people than it needs to maintain all systems, operate agricultural facilities, and maintain knowledge across specializations. The survivors must work longer hours, take on multiple roles, and abandon less critical systems. If the population drops below a certain threshold, recovery might be impossible. There simply aren't enough people to do all the necessary work. Systems begin failing faster than they can be repaired. Knowledge is lost because there's no one to teach. The ship enters a death spiral where each failure makes recovery less likely. The minimum viable population for a generation ship is debated, but it's probably measured in hundreds or thousands, not dozens. Below that threshold, genetic diversity, knowledge preservation, and operational capacity all become critically constrained. Finally, consider the scenario where Earth sends updated mission information, perhaps a warning about conditions at the destination or instructions to divert to a different target, but the message arrives garbled or incomplete due to interference or equipment failure. The crew receives fragments that might be misinterpreted, leading them to make decisions based on incomplete or incorrect information. Or worse, what if Earth stops transmitting entirely? Maybe civilization on Earth collapsed. Maybe humanity decided to abandon interstellar exploration. Maybe they're transmitting, but the ship's receiving equipment failed. The crew faces the psychological burden of not knowing whether Earth even exists anymore, whether they're the last humans in the universe. So, after exploring all the technical challenges, biological constraints, social dynamics, psychological factors, and potential failure modes, we arrive at the ultimate question: can a generation ship actually work? Can humanity realistically build a vessel capable of surviving 250 years in deep space and delivering a viable population to another star system? The honest answer is, we don't know. And that uncertainty itself is fascinating because it reveals fundamental gaps in our knowledge about long-term survival in space, multi-generational social stability, and engineering systems that must function for centuries without external support. Let's start with what we do know is possible. We know humans can survive in space for extended periods. Astronauts have lived aboard the International Space Station for a year or more. We know closed-loop life support systems can recycle air and water with high efficiency. We know how to shield against radiation, at least in principle. We know fusion reactors are theoretically possible, though we haven't yet built one that produces more energy than it consumes for sustained periods. We know how to preserve genetic material for decades or longer. All the individual components of a generation ship are within the realm of known physics and engineering. There's no magic, no violation of physical laws required. A generation ship doesn't need faster-than-light travel, artificial gravity fields, or exotic matter. It's conceptually achievable using technologies that are advanced but not science fiction. But here's the critical challenge. We've never integrated all these systems into a single self-sufficient vessel and operated it for centuries. We don't have empirical data on how these complex systems interact over such timescales. Engineering is built on testing and iteration. You build something, test it, find the failures, fix them, and repeat. For a generation ship, you can't do that. You get one chance. Think about the difference between building a bridge and building a generation ship. When engineers design a bridge, they can build scale models, test materials under stress, study how similar bridges have performed, and monitor the completed bridge for years to validate their assumptions. If problems emerge, they can reinforce or repair the bridge. There's a feedback loop between design and reality. For a generation ship, that feedback loop doesn't exist. You can test individual components on Earth or in Earth orbit, but you can't test the complete integrated system for 250 years before launching. Once it leaves, it's beyond repair from Earth. Any design flaws, any unanticipated interactions between systems, any long-term degradation modes that weren't predicted, all become the problem of the crew with no possibility of external rescue. This means generation ship design requires an unprecedented level of reliability engineering and redundancy. Every single system needs multiple backups. Every component needs to be over-designed beyond any normal engineering margins. The mass penalty for this redundancy is enormous, making the ship larger and more expensive, but it's absolutely necessary. Let me put the cost in perspective. Project Hyperion, one of the most detailed studies of generation ships, estimated that a vessel carrying 10,000 people to a nearby star would have a mass of around 10 million tons. For comparison, the International Space Station has a mass of about 450 tons. A generation ship would be more than 20,000 times more massive. Launching that much mass from Earth using current rocket technology is completely impractical. The cost would be astronomical, probably exceeding the entire GDP of Earth for multiple years. This is why realistic generation ship scenarios assume construction in space, using resources mined from asteroids or the Moon, assembled in orbit over decades or centuries. But this raises another question. If humanity has the technological and industrial capability to mine asteroids, construct multi-million-ton spacecraft in orbit, and develop fusion propulsion, do we even need generation ships? A civilization with that capability might have other options for interstellar travel, or might even decide that spreading throughout our own solar system offers better returns on investment. This gets at a deeper question about the purpose of generation ships. Are they a practical means of interstellar colonization, or are they more of a civilizational insurance policy? If something catastrophic happens to Earth, asteroid impact, nuclear war, climate collapse, having humans established on distant worlds means the species survives, even if the homeworld doesn't. From that perspective, even a difficult, expensive, risky generation ship mission might be worthwhile if it ensures humanity's long-term survival. You're not just sending 10,000 people to another star. You're backing up human civilization, preserving our knowledge, culture, and biology against existential risks. But there's a darker possibility we need to consider. What if generation ships are actually impossible, not because of technical limitations, but because of social and psychological ones? What if human societies simply can't maintain the necessary cohesion, purpose, and knowledge across the multiple generations required? We have very limited data on multi-generational isolated societies. The longest continuous human habitation of any isolated environment is probably Antarctic research stations, and people there rotate in and out, knowing they'll eventually return to the wider world. We have some examples of isolated island populations that maintained themselves for generations, but they had a planet beneath their feet with natural ecosystems, not a metal can in the void. The psychological challenges might be insurmountable. Every single person aboard the generation ship, except the final generation, will live their entire life knowing they'll never reach the destination. They're born in transit, live in transit, and die in transit. Their existence is entirely instrumental, valuable only as a link in the chain between the launch generation and the arrival generation. Can people live meaningful lives under those conditions? Or does it create a corrosive nihilism where each generation questions why they should sacrifice for descendants they'll never meet to reach a world they'll never see? Some science fiction has explored scenarios where generation ship crews rebel, deciding to turn around and go home, or abandon the mission and just live in space indefinitely. There's also the question of cultural drift. Over 10 generations, languages evolve, values change, knowledge is reinterpreted. The society that arrives might be culturally unrecognizable compared to the society that launched. They might not even care about establishing a planetary colony, having adapted so completely to life in space that returning to a gravity well seems unappealing. This is actually a fascinating possibility. What if generation ships don't deliver colonists to planets, but instead become permanent nomadic space habitats? The crew becomes so adapted to ship life that they choose to remain in space, perhaps mining asteroids in the destination system for resources, but never settling on the surface. They become a truly spacefaring civilization, not planetary beings who occasionally venture into space. Some futurists argue that this might be the natural evolution of spacefaring humanity. Planets are actually inconvenient for advanced civilizations. Most of your resources are locked in a deep gravity well. Planets have weather, tectonics, and other uncontrollable variables. Artificial habitats in space can be customized to exact specifications, rotated for gravity, moved to convenient location, and expanded as needed. From this perspective, generation ships aren't a means to colonize planets, but rather the first step toward a fully spacefaring civilization. The destination star system provides resources and energy, but the actual habitat remains the rotating cylinders and modules that people have lived in for generations. Let's talk about alternatives to generation ships, because they're not the only approach to interstellar travel. One alternative is suspended animation or cryogenic sleep. If you could freeze the crew for the journey and wake them at the destination, you avoid all the multi-generational social and psychological challenges. The same people who leave Earth arrive at the destination, but cryogenic preservation of humans for decades or centuries is currently impossible. We can freeze individual cells and tissues, even embryos, but a whole human body contains too much water. Ice crystals form during freezing, rupturing cell membranes and causing catastrophic damage. Some organisms can survive freezing through biological antifreeze compounds, but scaling this to human-sized organisms with complex organs is an unsolved problem. Even if we solved the freezing problem, there's the question of metabolism during suspension. Is the person truly frozen with all biological processes stopped, or are they merely slowed to a near halt? If processes continue at any level, you need power to maintain the suspension, and over centuries, even minimal power consumption per person adds up. Another alternative is embryo colonization. Instead of sending live adults or suspended adults, You send frozen embryos and artificial wombs. Robots or AI systems manage the ship during transit, then grow the embryos and raise the children at the destination. This dramatically reduces the mass requirements since you don't need life support for adults during the journey. But this raises profound ethical questions. Who raises these children? If it's robots and AI, what kind of society and culture do they create? The children would have no connection to Earth culture, no parents in any traditional sense, no multi-generational transmission of knowledge and values. They'd be raised by machines to establish a colony on an alien world. Is this ethical? Is it even wise? There's also the digital approach. Upload human minds into computers, transmit the data as radio signals to the destination at the speed of light, and reconstruct the minds in artificial bodies or simulations at the other end. This requires technologies we don't have, mind uploading, strong AI, and it raises philosophical questions about whether a digital copy is really you or just a simulation that thinks it's you. Then there are more exotic possibilities. Laser-pushed light sails that could potentially reach significant fractions of light speed using lasers beamed from the solar system. Fusion ramjets that collect interstellar hydrogen for fuel. Even more speculative ideas like wormholes or warp drives that might not violate physics but require technologies or materials we can't currently create. Each alternative has its own challenges and requirements. Generation ships, for all their difficulties, have the advantage of using relatively conventional technologies. No suspended animation, no mind uploading, no exotic physics. Just a really big spaceship with really reliable systems operated by regular humans who happen to be born live and die aboard during a very long journey. So let's return to the original question. How long could a generation ship survive in deep space? Based on everything we've discussed, I'd say that with sufficient redundancy, robust engineering, careful social planning, and considerable luck, a generation ship could potentially survive for 250 years or even longer. The key word is potentially. The technical challenges are immense, but probably solvable with enough resources and engineering effort. The biological challenges of maintaining a healthy population are significant but not insurmountable. The social and psychological challenges are perhaps the most uncertain because we have the least empirical data. If I had to estimate probability of success, accounting for all the things that could go wrong, technical failures, biological catastrophes, social collapse, navigational errors, I'd say a well-designed generation ship might have somewhere between a 20 to 50% chance of successfully delivering a viable population to its destination. That might sound pessimistic, but for a mission of such unprecedented scope and duration, those odds might actually be acceptable. Think about it this way. If you launch 10 generation ships to 10 different star systems, and 5 of them succeed, you've established humanity on 5 new worlds. Even with a 50% failure rate, you've expanded the sphere of human civilization across multiple star systems. From a species survival perspective, that's an enormous win. The real question isn't whether generation ships can work in principle, but whether humanity will ever commit the resources to build them. We're talking about projects spanning centuries, costing more than any single national economy could afford, requiring international cooperation on an unprecedented scale, all for benefits that won't be realized for hundreds of years. This is antithetical to how human societies normally operate. We focus on short-term gains, immediate problems, benefits we can see within our lifetimes. Convincing humanity to invest staggering resources in a project whose success won't be known for centuries requires a fundamental shift in how we think about our future. Perhaps the most important lesson from studying generation ships isn't about the ships themselves, but about what they reveal about human civilization. They force us to think in timescales beyond individual lifetimes, to plan for descendants we'll never meet, to cooperate on projects that span generations. These are exactly the kinds of thinking we need to address challenges like climate change, resource depletion, and long-term sustainability. In a sense, Earth itself is a generation ship. We're all aboard this planet, traveling through space, dependent on finite resources, responsible for maintaining the systems that keep us alive for future generations. The challenges of managing a generation ship, maintaining environmental systems, preserving knowledge, ensuring social stability, are metaphors for the challenges of managing our own world sustainably. Maybe we won't build actual generation ships for centuries, if ever. Maybe we'll develop alternative technologies that make them unnecessary. Or maybe we'll decide that our solar system offers enough space and resources that interstellar travel isn't worth the cost and risk. But studying generation ships, pushing our engineering and imagination to conceive of how humans might survive centuries in deep space, teaches us about limits, possibilities, and what it means to be a spacefaring species. It forces us to grapple with questions about identity, purpose, sacrifice, and our relationship with future generations. And who knows? Somewhere in the future, perhaps centuries from now, when humanity has spread throughout the solar system and our technology has advanced beyond what we can currently imagine, someone might look at all that we've learned and say, "You know what? I think we're finally ready to build a generation ship." And if you think generation ships sound challenging, wait until you see why even light-speed travel wouldn't be enough to explore the universe. Click the video on screen to discover why the universe's true scale is far more mind-bending than we imagined. Trust me, you need to see this.